Extras. What Aunt Zelda Saw in the Duck Pond. We are back in the young army nursery. In the semi-darkness of the nursery, the matron midwife puts the baby Septimus in a cot and sits down wearily. She keeps glancing anxiously at the door as if waiting for someone to come in. No one appears. A minute or two later, she heaves herself up from the chair and goes over to the cot where her own baby is crying and picks the child up. At that moment, the door is flung open and the matron midwife wheels around, white-faced, frightened. A tall woman in black stands in the doorway. Over her black, well-pressed robes, she wears the starched white apron of a nurse, but around her waist is a blood-red belt showing the 3 black stars of Dom Daniel. She has come for Septimus Heap. The nurse is late. She got lost on her way to the nursery, and now she is flustered and afraid. Dom Daniel does not tolerate lateness. She sees the matron midwife with a baby, just as she has been told she would. She does not know that the matron midwife is holding her own child in her arms, and that Septimus Heap is asleep in a cot in the dim shadows of the nursery. The nurse runs over to the midwife and seizes the baby from her. The midwife protests. She tries to wrestle her baby back from the nurse, but her desperation is more than matched by the nurse's determination to make it back to the boat in time for the tide. The taller young nurse wins. She bundles up the baby in a long red cloth emblazoned with 3 black stars, and runs out, pursued by the screaming midwife who knows exactly how Sarah Heap felt only a few hours ago. The midwife is forced to give up her chase at the barracks door, where the nurse, flaunting her 3 black stars, has the matron midwife arrested by the guard, and disappears into the night, triumphantly carrying off the midwife's own child to Dom Daniel. Back in the nursery, the old woman who is meant to be babysitting wakes up. Coughing and wheezing, she gets up and makes up 4 nighttime bottles for her charges, 1 each for the triplets, boys 409, 410, and 411, and 1 for the newest recruit to the young army, 12 hours old Septimus Heap, destined to be known for the next 10 years as boy 412. Aunt Zelda sighed. This was as she had expected. Next, she asked the moon to follow the midwife's child. There was something else she needed to know. The nurse just makes it back to the boat in time. A thing stands at the stern of the boat and sculls her across the river using the old fisherman's way with just 1 oar. On the other side she is met by a dark horseman, riding a huge black horse. He pulls the nurse and the child up behind him and canters off into the night. They have a long and uncomfortable ride ahead of them. By the time they reach Dom Daniel's lair, high up in the old slate quarries of the Badlands, the midwife's baby is screaming, and the nurse has a terrible headache. Dom Daniel is waiting to see his prize, which he takes to be Septimus Heap, the 7th son of a 7th son. The apprentice that every wizard and every necromancer dreams of. The apprentice who will give him the power to return him to the castle and take back what is rightfully his. He looks at the screaming baby with distaste. The screams make his head ache and his ears ring. It is a big baby for a newborn, thinks Dom Daniel, and an ugly one too. He doesn't like it very much. The necromancer has an air of disappointment about him as he tells the nurse to take the baby away. The nurse puts the baby in the waiting cot and goes to bed. She feels too ill to get up the next day, and no one bothers to feed the midwife's son until well into the next night. There is no apprentice supper for this apprentice. Aunt Zelda sat by the duck pond and smiled. The apprentice is free of his dark master. Septimus Heap is alive and has found his family. The princess is safe. She remembered something Marcia often said. Things do have a habit of working out, eventually. After. Whatever happened to Gringe the Gatekeeper. Gringe remained the North Gatekeeper throughout all the upheavals at the castle. Although he would rather have jumped into a vat of boiling oil than admit it, Gringe loved his job, and it gave his family a secure home in the gatehouse after many years of living rough under the castle walls. The day that Marcia had given him a half-crown turned out to be an important day for Gringe. That day, for the first and only time ever, Gringe kept some of the bridge money. Marcia's half-crown, to be exact. There was something about the thick, solid silver disc lying warm and heavy in the palm of his hand that made Gringe reluctant to put it into the toll box, so he slipped it into his pocket, telling himself he would add it to the day's takings that night. But Gringe could not bring himself to part with the half-crown, and so the half-crown sat in his pocket for many months, until Gringe began to consider it his own. And there the half-crown would have stayed had it not been for a notice Gringe found nailed up on the north gate one cold morning almost a year later. Young Army Conscription Edict. All boys aged 11 to 16 years who are not apprenticed to a recognized trade are to report to the young army barracks at 0600 hours tomorrow. Gringe felt sick. His son Rupert had celebrated his 11th birthday the previous day. Mrs. Gringe was hysterical when she saw the notice. Gringe felt hysterical too, but when he saw Rupert, white-faced, reading the notice, he decided he had to stay calm. He shoved his hands in his pockets and thought, and when, out of habit, his hand closed around Marcia's half-crown, Gringe knew he had the answer. As soon as the boatyard was opening that morning, they had a new apprentice, Rupert Gringe, whose father had just secured a 7-year apprenticeship with Janet Martin, a herring boat builder, for the substantial down payment of a half-crown. The matron midwife. After the matron midwife was arrested, she was taken to the castle asylum for deluded and distressed persons due to her distraught state of mind and preoccupation with baby snatching, which was not considered to be a healthy preoccupation for a midwife to have. After spending a few years there, she was allowed to leave because the asylum was becoming overcrowded. There had been a huge increase in deluded and distressed people since the supreme custodian had taken over the castle, and the matron midwife was now neither deluded nor distressed enough to merit a place, and so Agnes Meredith, former matron midwife, now unemployed bag lady, packed her many bags and set off to search for her lost son Marin. The night servant. The supreme custodian's night servant was thrown into a dungeon after dropping the crown and adding another dent to it. He was released a week later by mistake and went to work in the palace kitchens as an undercook peeling potatoes, which he was good at, and soon progressed to be chief potato peeler. He enjoyed his job. No one minded if he dropped a potato. Judge Alice Nettles. Alice Nettles first met Arthur Mello when she was a trainee advocate at the castle court. Arthur had yet to become Dom Daniel's apprentice, but Alice could tell that Arthur was special. Even after Arthur became the extraordinary wizard and was much talked about as that awful apprentice who pushed his master from the tower, Alice kept seeing him. She knew that Arthur was incapable of killing anything, even an irritating ant. Shortly after Arthur became extraordinary wizard, Alice achieved her ambition of becoming a judge. Soon their separate careers began to keep Arthur and Alice increasingly busy, and they never saw as much of each other as they would have liked to, something that Alice always regretted. It was a terrible double blow to Alice when, in the space of a few days, the custodians not only killed the dearest friend she had ever had, but also took away her life's work when they banned women from the courthouse. Alice left the castle and went to stay with her brother in the port. After some time she recovered enough from Arthur's death to take a job as legal adviser to the customs house. It was after a long day dealing with a tricky problem involving a smuggled camel and a traveling circus that Alice repaired to the Blue Anchor Tavern before she returned to her brother's house. It was there, to her delight, that she finally met the ghost of Arthur Mello. The assassin. The assassin suffered complete memory loss after being hit by Marcia's thunderflash. She was also quite badly burned. When the hunter had collected the pistol from the assassin, he had left her lying where he had found her, unconscious on Marcia's carpet. Dom Daniel had had her thrown out into the snow, but she was found by the night street sweepers and taken to the nuns' hospice. She eventually recovered and stayed on at the hospice, working as a helper. Luckily for her, her memory never returned. Linda Lane. Linda Lane was given a new identity and moved into some luxurious rooms overlooking the river to reward her for finding the princess. However, some months later, she was recognized by the family of one of her previous victims, and late one night, as she sat on her balcony with a glass of her favorite wine supplied by the supreme custodian, Linda Lane was pushed off and fell into the fast-flowing river. She was never found. The youngest kitchen maid. After the youngest kitchen maid started having nightmares about wolves, her sleep became so badly disturbed that she often fell asleep at work. One day she dozed off while she was meant to be turning the spit, and a whole sheep went up in flames. It was only the prompt action of the chief potato peeler that saved her from the same fate as the sheep. The youngest kitchen maid was demoted to assistant potato peeler, but 3 weeks later she ran away with the chief potato peeler to start a better life in the port. The 5 Northern Traders. After their hurried exit from Sally Mullen's tea and ale house, the 5 Northern traders spent the night on their ship, stowing away their wares and preparing to leave on the early morning high tide. They had been caught up in an unpleasant changes of government before and had no wish to stay around and see what happened this time. In the trader's experience, it was always a nasty business. As they sailed past the smoldering remains of Sally Mullen's tea and alehouse the next morning, they knew they were right, but they gave little thought to Sally as they set off down the river, planning their voyage south to escape the big freeze, and looking forward to the warmer climes of the far countries. The northern traders had seen it all before and did not doubt they would see it all again. The washing-up boy. The washing-up boy employed by Sally Mullen was convinced that it was his fault the tea and alehouse burned down. He was sure he must have left the tea towels drying too close to the fire just as he had done before, but he was not one to let these things trouble him for long. The washing-up boy believed that every setback was an opportunity in disguise, and so he built a small hut on wheels, and every day he trundled it down to the custodian guard barracks and sold meat pies and sausages to the guards. The contents of his pies and sausages varied and depended on what the washing-up boy could get hold of, but he worked hard, making the pies late into the night, and did a brisk trade all day. If people began to notice that their cats and dogs were disappearing at an alarming rate, no one thought to link it with the sudden appearance of the washing-up boy's meat pie hut, and when the ranks of the custodian guards were devastated by food poisoning, it was the barracks canteen cook who was blamed. The washing-up boy prospered and never ever ate one of his own meat pies or sausages. Rupert Grint. Rupert Grint was the best apprentice Janet Martin had ever had. Janet built shallow draught herring boats which could fish the waters near the shore and trap the shoals of herring by running them up against the sandbanks just outside the port. Any herring fisherman in possession of a Janet Martin boat was sure of a good living, and it soon became known that if Rupert Grint had worked on the boat, you were lucky. The boat would sit well in the water and run fast with the wind. Janet recognized talent when she saw it, and she soon trusted Rupert to work on his own. The first boat Rupert built entirely by himself was Muriel. He painted her a dark green like the depths of the river, and gave her deep red sails like the late summer sunsets over the sea. Lucy Gringe. Lucy Gringe had met Simon Heap at a dance class for young ladies and gentlemen when they were both 14. Mrs. Gringe had sent Lucy along to keep her out of trouble for the summer. Simon had gone to the class by mistake. Silas had had some trouble with reading and often got his letters mixed up, had thought it was a trance class, and had made the mistake of mentioning it to Sarah one evening. Simon overheard, and after much pestering, Silas had enrolled him in the class. Lucy loved the way Simon was determined to be the best dancer in the class, just as Simon was always determined to be the best at everything, and she liked his green wizard eyes and his curly blonde hair too. Simon had no idea why he liked a girl all of a sudden, but for some reason he found he could not stop thinking about Lucy. Lucy and Simon continued to see each other whenever they could, but kept their meetings secret. They knew neither of their families would approve. The day Lucy ran away to get married to Simon Heap was the best and worst day of her life. It was the best day right up until the guards burst into the chapel and took him away. After that, Lucy didn't care what happened to her. Gringe came and took her home. He locked her up at the top of the gatehouse tower to stop her running away, and begged her to forget about Simon Heap. Lucy refused and would not speak to her father at all. Gringe was heartbroken. He had only done what he thought best for his daughter. Jenna's shield bug. When the ex-millipede fell off Domdaniel, it bounced and ended up on top of a barrel. The barrel was washed overboard as the Vengeance was pulled down into the Quake ooze. It floated off to the port where it fetched up on the town beach. The shield bug dried out its wings and flew off to a nearby field where a traveling circus had just arrived. For some reason it took a particular dislike to an inoffensive buffoon, and it caused great amusement to the audience every night as the bug chased the buffoon around the ring. The swimmers and the chicken boat. The two swimmers who were thrown from the Vengeance were lucky to survive. Jake and Barry Parfit, whose mother had insisted on teaching them to swim before they became seafarers, were not particularly strong swimmers, and it was all they could do to keep their heads above water as the storm raged around them. They were beginning to give up hope when Barry saw a fishing boat come toward them. Although there appeared to be no one on board the fishing boat, there was an unusual gangplank hanging down from the deck. With their last ounce of strength, Jake and Barry pulled themselves up onto the gangplank and collapsed onto the deck, where they found themselves surrounded by chickens. But they didn't care what they were surrounded by as long as it wasn't water. When the waters eventually ebbed from the Moran marshes, Jake, Barry, and the chickens came to rest on one of the marsh islands. They decided to stay put, out of the way of Domdaniel, and soon there was a thriving chicken farm some miles away from Dragon Island. The Message Rat. Stanley was eventually rescued from his prison under the floorboards of the ladies' washroom by one of the old rat office rats, who had heard what had happened to him. He spent some time recovering at the rat's nest at the top of the Eastgate Gatehouse Tower, where Lucy Grinch took to feeding him biscuits and confiding her troubles to him. In Stanley's opinion, Lucy Grinch had had a lucky escape. If anyone had ever asked Stanley, he would have told them that the wizards in general, and wizards called Heap in particular, were nothing but trouble, but no one ever did ask.